26. Creating taxi service enterprises for BPTT. Enterprise formation from scratch. In all of the drama with land and farms, my deepest concern continued to be supporting persons in creating wealth through business enterprises. In the interim, I had written many business plans and seen most of them come to fruition. However, one of the most ambitious projects in this regard was the BPTT Taxi Service Providers Enterprises. Its origin was no less intriguing. In 2003, Dr. Thackeray Driver, known to us as Dax, was the CEO of the Southern Chamber of Commerce. It was later renamed the Energy Chamber. This chamber had among its membership all of the major oil and natural gas companies operating in Trinidad and Tobago. At a meeting of the chamber, BPTT announced that it was seeking to restructure its taxi service portfolio. This oil giant at that time was receiving services from 120 different taxi service providers in Port of Spain and in Galeota, Mayaro. In BPTT's policy, any employee of the company had the power to order a taxi service to any destination during working hours, sign a voucher, and leave it to the carrier to present the same to the finance department for payment. In this rather confusing scenario, BPTT was spending upwards of $8.3 million annually on its transportation. As Dax Driver would later relate the story, he raised a concern that abandoning these small providers for one of the large car rental companies would leave a significant section of the rural community with reduced incomes. He suggested that BPTT consider organizing these service providers into larger groups, possibly companies, which would bring more order and stability to the situation. As a follow-up, Dax informed the meeting that he knew the right person to do such a job. Well, I first met Dax as the government's counterpart to my role as coordinator of the LUPAC project. We worked together to bring the results of these interventions to the attention of the various government departments with responsibility for land administration. I am not sure why Dax thought that I could successfully navigate such a chaotic situation. All I remember was receiving a call from Dax saying, "Alan, I hope you don't get angry with me, but I just volunteered you for what may turn out to be an impossible task." Soon, BPTT was in contact with me, offering to transport me to meetings they had initiated with the taxi drivers in Mayaro. This exercise was being orchestrated by Mrs. Ann Bates, who was part of their HR department at that time. Needless to say, these meetings were vociferous, with accusations flying left and center, and my arrival on the scene seemed to have only aggravated the situation. The process of holding such meetings soon became my own responsibility, although getting there was theirs. After all, these were folks in the taxi service, so transporting me from Arima to Mayaro was not a challenge. The meetings continued in the same vein that they had started. I remember at one meeting, a tall Rasta-style leader of the Southern drivers coming up to the front table with a series of wild conspiracy accusations. For instance, he stated that he knew where I was living in Arima and threatened to bring all of his children there on Christmas morning so that I can provide them with their Christmas toys. Problem was that the poor chap did not know that I was all too familiar with that bravado stunt. I grew up lying down in the streets of Georgetown blocking the governor from going to deliver his throne speech. I knew then that I had no capacity nor intention of really doing any harm to the governor. So while he did his threatening stunt, I would just sit quietly and allow all of the abusive language to slide into oblivion without causing too much distraction. My assistant in this assignment was Beaumont Celestine, a UE graduate, 1986, who, fortunately for me, was much quieter than I was at his age. We spent the first 5 months of this assignment painstakingly piecing together the array of irregularities that plagued this service arrangement. Although everyone employed by BPTT was afforded the privilege of initiating his or her own taxi service requests, this led to problems of multiple service access, ad hoc trip scheduling, confused authorization processes, and some indications of apparent service abuse. Our primary focus was on 10 major activities. 1. Composing business plans. 2. Formulating decision tracker. 3. Attending readiness meetings. 4. Tracking readiness decisions. 5. Proposing a handbook of operations. 6. Interviews with stakeholders. 7. Identifying and supporting training needs. 8. Supporting office management system. 9. Supporting and testing computerized data systems. And 10. Troubleshooting startup activities. The first issue that concerned these drivers for BPTT was how much they would be able to charge for their services. The base fare for a return trip from San Fernando to Port of Spain for the Galeota-based taxi was supposed to be $400. We had observed instances in which this trip had been invoiced from 173% to as high as 345% above the base fare. Complicating matters further, there were noticeable differences in the reported payments to taxi service providers, with the highest being 38 times greater than the lowest. Now, this is how these folks made their money. They did not all have taxis. What they had was a controlled access to this lucrative market. The major players in this drama had evolved a system in which 60% of the taxis utilized by the service providers were acquired through subcontracting. Anyone with a taxi who wanted to participate had to come through this small control group. The taxi service providers referred to this system as utilizing ad hocs. We started outlining practices and protocols, establishing codes of conduct, uniform price structures, discipline, and everything one could imagine necessary to operate an efficient service business. We focused on 2 groups, one in Port of Spain and the other in Galeota. Hours, days, and weeks were spent responding to their legitimate concerns as well as to the conspiracy theories. We conducted internal surveys to pin down the vexing issues such as unequal access to job opportunities, dispatching by BPTT, differences in prices charged, there were contracts in Mayaro but none in Port of Spain, professionalism and self-promotion, clientele preferences, change in the location of the heliport, which moved from Mayaro to Piaco, and tolerance for the abuse of service. There was no doubt in anyone's mind that reducing the number of companies providing taxi service to BPTT would significantly change the business environment. This was the convenient truth that provided the basis for rumors and doubts about the taxi service providers. Their biggest fear was that BPTT was laying the groundwork for some major automobile company, such as TCM or Southern Sales, to outmaneuver them in winning the new service contracts. Quick thinking caused us to focus on the dispatching system as the heart of most of the concerns of the taxi service providers. We approached this subject by seeking consensus on three important aspects of dispatching, namely load balancing, that is equalizing the taxi service workload, load sharing, that is smoothing out transient peak overload periods, and load routing, that is deciding to which node the load should be shunted. You can imagine how nervous everyone became when we started speaking about load. This meant money. Every time we would get into one of those log jams, all we had to do was to raise the chant, "Fair is fair." It worked. Not too many of these folks were willing to be identified with the counterpoint that unfair is fair. The main features that I had insisted on was to capture this load sharing process in a computerized taxi management system called TMS. A young programmer named Dale Deserve, apparently convinced about the sincerity of my efforts, volunteered to build this comprehensive information system that would control every aspect from dispatching to invoicing. Dale had a lot of patience with me and acceded to my desire to have the system report the data in as much detail and in a compatible format that was currently used by BPTT in their own financial accounting. After 18 months of confidence building and internal negotiations, finally, 2 new taxi companies were incorporated as limited liability companies in January 2005. Premier Limousine and Taxi Services Limited was incorporated in Port of Spain, and Executive Consolidated Taxi Limited in Mayaro. Within the first year of operations, Executive Taxi had invoiced BPTT a total of $8.84 million, becoming mature and competitive. In 2007, BPTT decided to discontinue the preferential status afforded these 2 service companies and sought to put its transportation service out for public tender. This caused panic among the members of both companies. They came complaining to me that they wished to argue that BPTT must continue to give them exclusive access because they are the children of this giant company. I felt a hidden pleasure in assuring them that they had nothing to fear. Just congratulate BPTT on this bold move. Tell them that you fully concur with their motive, but ask that they ensure that all bidders show their capacity to invoice BPTT in the detail that is necessary for its own accounting. We were told that the major car rental companies were busy shopping for software that would be able to handle the details that our taxi service TMS was accustomed to reporting. Obviously, our taxi service companies easily won in the open bid. In fact, an astutely placed management information system had created strategic space for these 2 companies. It helped them to win additional bids from other oil companies for similar transportation services. I'm told that Premier in Port of Spain was dissolved after 5 years, and that EC Taxi from Mayaro was able to take over their portion of this service.